Talofa Lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Suisuiki. Coming up, China launches a missile test into the Pacific Ocean for the first time in 44 years. Also,
the world needs to ensure that the high seas seabed is not stripped of its unique biodiversity.
Seabed mining, a topic of debate at the UN, and later on,
Bougainville cocoa butter is particularly high quality and it's being used by chocolate producers in Australia and elsewhere.
Bougainville wraps up its annual chocolate festival. On Wednesday, China carried out a ballistic missile test in the Pacific Ocean. China tests missiles routinely, but this is the first test into the Pacific in decades. New Zealand's Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters has called it an unwelcoming and concerning development. Nuclear policy expert and Stanton Senior Fellow Ankit Panda says the test may have been designed to showcase the credibility of China's nuclear capabilities.
China regularly tests long-range missiles, but what was particularly interesting about this one is that it flew into the Pacific Ocean, which is incredibly unusual. In fact, it hasn't happened in the last 44 years since May 1980, so certainly it drew a degree of interest. So it's really the rarity of this particular event that I think gives it notability. But otherwise, the Chinese do test long-range missiles over their own territory quite regularly.
China said it was a regular test 44 years since they have done a test like this into the Pacific. Are they being a bit disingenuous saying that this is routine?
I did find that notable in their statement that they called this routine and annual, because they certainly don't routinely and annually carry out full-range intercontinental ballistic missile tests into the Pacific. That's right.
So what is the significance of this occurring?
So there are multiple ways to read this. I think there is, of course, the technical rationale here that this kind of missile testing does provide Chinese scientists and technicians with new kind of data. That's useful, of course, in the course of developing and maintaining a nuclear weapons capability. There is the domestic component of this, too, that I would emphasize. The People's Liberation Army has been under tremendous scrutiny for corruption, and specifically the Rocket Force, which is the branch of the Chinese military charged with operating these missiles, including all of China's ground-launched missiles more generally, has seen a leadership purge in recent years and has come under scrutiny as well for corruption. And so this kind of a test could be designed to bolster morale, communicate to internal audiences that China's nuclear capabilities remain relevant, but also communicates to its to outside stakeholders, including the United States, that China's nuclear capabilities remain as credible as they've always been. And I think that's particularly important as well. And of course, I think the bigger picture here is that we are seeing a substantial change in how China thinks about the role of its own nuclear capabilities and what it asks its nuclear weapons to do for its national security. And I think this unusual test, which is something we haven't seen in decades, represents, I think, yet another source of general change in how China approaches its nuclear weapons capabilities.
Does this play into that geopolitical struggle that's happening in the Pacific at the moment with China and then traditional partners in the Pacific, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, France?
So I think it's certainly going to be interpreted through those lenses, but we should bear in mind that this kind of testing is generally routine for other countries that possess nuclear weapons. The United States, the United Kingdom, the French, to a lesser extent the Russians, although the Russians also like to test over their own territory, do carry out this kind of testing quite regularly. The U.S. tests its own ICBMs into the Pacific as well. You could also make the argument that this is actually the kind of testing that the U.S. would probably want to see from China, because this was, of course, pre-notified, and the Chinese did issue warnings to mariners and to airmen, which are, generally speaking, the kinds of practices you would want to see from a country carrying out these kinds of long-range tests. So while there is, I think, a general angle that could connect this to geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China, I think this is simply what we expect from countries that do rely on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence for their national security, that they will carry out these kinds of tests from time to time. The big question with China is, are we entering a period now where this kind of testing from China is going to become fairly regularized, as it is in the United States, for instance?
Have Washington responded to this?
So I have not seen any direct reaction yet from the United States to this particular event. We might not get one because I think the U.S. might prefer to simply treat this as part of China's own business in the same way that the U.S. would not want China to react to its ICBM tests. I think the United States understands that this isn't particularly connected to any geopolitical developments or events.
Four people connected with a so-called black flight from Papua New Guinea intending to deliver a huge quantity of cocaine to Australia have been sentenced in the National Court. They were part of a failed attempt to fly 611 kilograms of cocaine, valued at 200 million kina, from an airfield outside Port Moresby. The plane crashed at the end of the runway on takeoff. The Australian pilot John Cutmore was sentenced to 18 years last year, but now four others, one Italian and three Papua New Guineans, have also been sentenced. Don Wiseman spoke with our PNG correspondent Scott Whitey, who says the whole episode seems unbelievable.
Yeah, I've just finished reading the judgment handed down by Justice Penuel Mogish, and it's amazing how the people were recruited. I mean, those three Papua New Guineans were recruited, and how the money was paid, and then the chain of events that led up to their arrests, and particularly the arrest of the Italian national that brought in the drugs via the yacht. So the intelligence gathering, I must say, was really good by the Australian Federal Police and the members of the RPNGC, and that was what led to this successful conviction almost 4 years later.
Yes, it was quite interesting how these drugs, once the plane had failed to take off and they'd taken the cocaine out of the plane and then moved it all around the place, moved to half a dozen different locations, and quite a number of weeks later it was found and people were arrested.
Yes, this particular case just exposes the vast network that we have in Papua New Guinea, and Papua New Guinea being used as a transit point, and the links between external parties, particularly the syndicates linked to Australia and outside of Australia as well, and the people within the country and the places, the points that they use. So it's a vast network. We've been talking about the Papua New Guinea being used as a transit point, and I've personally been very interested in that particular network and been doing it for over 10 years. But in the last 5 years, we've seen this network being exposed and people being arrested for it, and particularly when the black flight, the cocaine flight that landed in Port Moresby, really put that network to the fore, because previously it was just allegations that foreign cartels were using Papua New Guinea as a transit point. So this was what was discussed in conferences, or the possibility of seeing cartels use Papua New Guinea as a transit point. And then suddenly this big one that happened with half a ton of cocaine being brought in.
Now, one of the oddities for PNG has been they didn't have laws in place that could cater for someone who was trying to bring in half a ton of cocaine. The laws that existed at the time were fairly feeble, weren't they?
Yeah, the laws at the time were very weak, and the only drugs that were listed were medical drugs and things like marijuana, which was at the time considered one of the biggest problems that we had. And obviously times have changed. We've got newer drugs, including cocaine and meth, that are available now. And what the legislators have done is just included cocaine and other drugs, including methamphetamine, and plus their ingredients, into legislation and made it tougher, as well as the penalty. So the maximum penalty for cocaine, and I think meth as well, is 25 years for smuggling, and a penalty of 500,000 kina, 500,000 kina, or both, depending on the judge. So that's how tough the penalties are at the moment. The person at the center of this who received the highest sentence, the Italian national, was expecting, according to the court documents, expecting to get a lenient sentence by the courts, but he didn't. He got the highest sentence of 19 years, and he's going to serve 16 years in prison. And his lawyers were also arguing that he should be sent to Italy or be given special treatment. The judge said no, he's going to receive the full sentence and serve his time in Papua New Guinea. So twist of fate for him. He was expecting something else, but got something harsher.
Yes. with the Papua New Guineans, clearly extremely naive bunch of chaps. They didn't have criminal records, never done anything like this before, and I guess, well, they're not going to do it again either.
Yeah, I think their lack of experience showed in this one because they were obviously, as you said, no criminal records, no prior convictions. So the judge took that into account. They also cooperated with police. I think they were also expecting a lenient sentence, but they got 1 year less than the foreign nationals. So yeah, new laws have been put in place by the legislators in Parliament, and that's what was used to have them convicted.
It was the biggest ever drug haul or drug find by authorities in PNG, wasn't it?
Yes, it is. This is the biggest. And I guess the other big case is the Bololo case, which the kingpin was arrested in Australia by the AFP. That is still being processed. So we could expect another set of convictions once that comes through as well.
Seabed mining has proven to be a divisive topic for Pacific leaders at the UN General Assembly debates this year. Some have tried to align the industry with the saving of the planet, while others say it will bring irreversible destruction to an already vulnerable ocean. Koroi Hawkins reports.
Nauru's President David Adiang was first out of the blocks in New York, saying the world will miss out on decarbonising the planet if deep-sea mining does not start immediately.
The greatest risk we face is not the potential environmental impacts of mineral recovery, but the risk of inaction. We cannot let fear and misinformation hold us back. We have the science, we have the technology, and we have the imperative. Let us rise to the challenge and opportunity before us, and let the time for action be now.
Marshall Islands President Hilda Heine's view on the industry is the complete opposite.
The world needs to ensure that the high seas seabed is not stripped of its unique biodiversity before we even document it. Without a clear-eyed scientific understanding of impacts and risks, the world's oceans are too fragile to turn into a speculative experiment.
The one thing Pacific leaders are united on is the need for ambitious action on the climate crisis. Representing Fiji in New York, President Ratu Viliame Katonivere urged UN states to address what he called glaring gaps in climate finance.
Deep, rapid and sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius must be vigorously pursued and accelerated. Both adaptation and mitigation finances require a substantial increase. We call on states to commit to finalizing the new collective quantified goal and address glaring gaps in climate finance.
Palau's Vice President Uduch Singabao Sr. told world leaders the climate crisis is putting pressure on its food security and economic stability.
The global response to climate change is a matter of life and death. Through the Paris Agreement and other international frameworks, we have underscored the vulnerabilities of island nations like ours. This is not only a present threat, but an existential crisis for future generations.
The President of the Federated States of Micronesia, Wesley Simina, also joined the chorus of Pacific leaders' voices on the need for urgent climate action, but he also raised a point in defiance of the crisis that regardless of how much the sea level rises, Pacific countries have taken steps to ensure their statehood is preserved in perpetuity.
Leaders from the Pacific Islands Forums, or PIF, and the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS, have affirmed that our maritime zones, as recognized by the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, will remain valid.
At the time this program was recorded, a host of Pacific leaders had yet to address the Assembly, including from Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, Samoa, Tuvalu and Solomon Islands.
The autonomous Papua New Guinea region of Bougainville is just wrapping up its annual chocolate festival in Arawa in the centre of the main island. The event, first held in 2019, aims to showcase Bougainville's cocoa production and to foster an interest in chocolate production. The New Zealand High Commissioner to PNG, Peter Zwartz, was there, and as he told Don Wiseman, he was clearly impressed.
It's my first time there, so I'm not able to kind of really compare. But look, it was a great occasion. I understand it was definitely bigger this year than previously. There were a lot of stalls and activities kind of designed for all ages farmers and young people and kids, and there were great crowds. It was a really positive atmosphere.
Tell us a little bit about the stall. Is it all chocolate, all cocoa?
The name is a good marketing tool, but it's not all chocolate. There were certainly examples of local chocolate being made in Bougainville, the Queen Emma that's being made in wider Papua New Guinea, but it really is showcasing quite a lot of cocoa products and other agricultural products. And then I guess the stalls are sort of like any kind of agricultural show. You've got suppliers, you've got input suppliers, you've got small SMEs establishing premium coffee product. You've got stalls showing locally produced animal feed. The New Zealand Police were there with a stall focusing on law and order issues and involving the kids in the community in key activities. And then there's a bit of a party atmosphere too. I think probably one of the big draw cards was a youth kind of Bougainville's Got Talent kind of thing with some great local singing talent.
Now, New Zealand, I think, along with Australia, has been pivotal to this development of chocolate making in Bougainville, hasn't it? What is your involvement and what's your involvement in the festival?
New Zealand, together with Australia, we've established something called the Bougainville Partnership. It's been running for a number of multi-year phases now, and it supports a range of work across economic and social and governance areas. In the economic area, yes, we have been supporting over a number of years replanting of cocoa with more cocoa pod resistant varieties. That's been quite important, but also helping Bougainville establish its legislation, and they've established a local cocoa regulatory body with a lab, and those are the ones that are innovating with chocolate production and the like. Bougainville definitely has some potential here. There were a number of international buyers there at the festival, which is really encouraging, and they were saying that Bougainvillian cocoa butter is particularly high quality, and it's being used by chocolate producers in Australia and elsewhere to lift the kind of quality and flavour profile of some of their chocolate with cocoa sourced from other areas. So there's potential for Bougainville to go for a high quality product, and we're really happy to be supporting this work. And we also sort of help cover some of the costs of Chocolate Festival itself.
And all of this, of course, comes at a time when the value of cocoa has shot through the roof for the benefit, particularly of these poor farmers in Bougainville and around.
Oh, it really has. And it's, for me, I try and make a visit to Bougainville. I'm here sort of periodically, but I try to travel down through all the way to South Bougainville and come back and sort of talk fairly widely once a year. And this year, it was really noticeable. Bougainvillians are an active, hardworking people. They're farmers. Without the big mine, people need to make a living from the land and the resources that they've got. And so it really is quite nice to see, just to give you a sense of the scale, that last year a bag of cocoa beans, dried fermented cocoa beans, cost about 500 kina. This year it's been up over 2,000 kina. I think at the moment it's settling about sort of 1,700. But that's about 4 times the price that farmers are getting in return for their labours. So there's a bit more cash around in Bougainville, which is encouraging. And I certainly saw a few new bicycles shiny on the roads, 1 or 2 new vehicles. I saw people carting building materials for houses. There's definitely reports of household solar being put in, and there's a lot of interest. And my speech there was really encouraging. Think about this windfall. Prices don't stay high all the time. They come up and go down. But to use this period of higher prices to invest in your infrastructure for quality. So there is definitely interested in improving the fermentaries and putting in solar dryers that can help improve the quality of the cocoa beans that they're producing.
That's Pacific Waves for today. For all episodes, head over to rnz.co.nz/Pacific. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, tō whā sui fua.